July 2, 1944. On the outskirts of Cherbourg, Normandy, a group of German nurses emerge from a cave dug beneath the earth, hands raised, lab coats dirty, eyes half closed, before a light they haven't seen in days. Hours earlier, the phrase spoken by one of them echoed among the rocks. Americans have no resources. This is propaganda. This belief was no exception. Inside the underground hospital, even surrounded, exhausted, and with the last vials of morphine being boiled and reused, they still relied on an idea disseminated for years. The enemy's medicine was inferior, decadent, improvised. This confidence, however, was about to collide with something that not even the most creative Allied propaganda would dare to invent. The thesis of this report does not start from the violence of the battlefield, but from a technical and moral collapse operated in silence. What these nurses would see and experience in the days ahead would be a profound break with everything they had learned under Nazi medical doctrine, because this is not a video about female prisoners of war. It's about prisoners of an idea, and what happens when reality forces them to abandon it. But before we dive behind the scenes of this quiet conversion, there is one statistic that defines the whole dimension of this story. By 1943, while Reich nurses were reusing gases, boiling syringes, and rationing sulfur dust as gold powder, the United States was already producing more than 21 billion units of penicillin a year, a figure so disproportionate that even German generals did not believe it to be real. In American hospitals, surgical instruments were discarded after their first use. On the German front, they barely existed to be cleared. And this is just the beginning, because the real collapse of these prisoners did not come from seeing the size of the stockpiles, but when he saw who delivered them, how they used them, and why. If you value the story told with precision, respect, and depth, leave your support with a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us to continue revealing the human backstage behind the military facts. Even before they set foot on American soil, Reich nurses carried more than rudimentary medical instruments and recycled bandages. They carried with them a deep-seated conviction that they were guardians of a superior, pure, scientific, and morally legitimate medicine. This belief did not arise by chance. From the beginning of the training, under the aegis of the NS Frauenwarte program and the guidelines of the Munich Institute of Racial Hygiene, German nurses were indoctrinated to believe that their function was not only to heal, but to select. Heal the strong, eliminate the weak. Medicine for them was a tool for racial empowerment, and not a universal instrument of care. In manuals, lectures, and advertisements, the portrait of the Allied doctor, especially the American one, was associated with moral corruption, ethical degeneration, and the supposed decadence of a liberal system weakened by miscegenation. In the words of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Americans don't have doctors, they have drug dealers. The caricature functioned as an ideological vaccine. It dehumanized the enemy and shielded national pride against any sign of admiration. Nazi medicine fed on an idea of purity, scientific, racial, national. On paper, it was an empire of biological logic. But in practice, as early as 1943, this empire was tottering. There was a lack of anesthetics, antibiotics, basic instruments. Hospitals in Germany closed entire wards due to lack of surgical supplies. Doctors performed direct transfusions between soldiers due to the lack of blood banks. Nurses reused bandages after boiling them in aluminum cans. And even then, the belief remained. It was temporary scarcity, not structural inferiority. Germany's mistake was to confuse discipline with abundance and propaganda with logistics. The ideological machine maintained this self-deception with carefully manipulated statistics. Internal reports from the Ministry of Health concealed the drop in pharmaceutical production, while radios and newspapers extolled the achievements of the doctors at the front, extolling heroic surgeries performed under adverse conditions, without explaining why such conditions persisted. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States produced 21 billion units of penicillin in 1943 alone. In contrast, Germany that same year did not produce even 5% of this volume, and what was produced, for the most part, never reached the front. Plasma production in the US was such that stockpiles were able to supply simultaneous campaigns in Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa without interruption. If this comparison surprises you, write in the comments, absolute power. The numbers don't lie, but the Nazi manuals omitted all of them. The nurses trained by the DRK, Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, were subjected to rigorous training in hygiene, triage, efficiency. But they also learned, and with emphasis, to differentiate patients by biological value. They were instructed to recognize signs of worthless life, a technical term of the eugenicist doctrine, which guided the treatment, or the absence of it, according to the individual's potential contribution to the Aryan ideal. Medicine became selective, morally calculated, and brutally efficient within the Nazi logic. For these professionals, the existence of well-stocked Allied field hospitals with beds for prisoners, blacks, Jews, or civilians injured by accident sounded not like nobility, but as weakness, and this weakness, they believed, would cost the enemy dearly. There was also technological contempt. Nazi Germany cultivated the belief that its medical engineering was second to none. Equipment such as autoclaves, oximeters, or X-ray machines were considered symbols of technical status that the New World would never understand. "They depend on machines, we have talent," said an instructor in Potsdam. It was ignored by ideological choice that America not only possessed this equipment, but manufactured it on an industrial scale. While Reich nurses operated in mobile hospitals with improvised generators, transportable American hospitals had standalone generators, refrigeration systems, sterilization units, and rudimentary barcode-controlled inventory. It was science applied to logistics, something that the centralized, hierarchical, and paranoid German military model could never replicate. What these women were about to witness, therefore, was not just a different system. It was a paradigm that challenged their professional identity. Because if American medicine worked better, and for everyone, what did that say about the ideal they served? The abyss that separated belief and reality began to open, and in the next part it will become insurmountable. Because when Allied medical convoys advanced through Tunisia in May 1943, one of the first units captured was made up entirely of medical personnel, nurses from the Afrika Korps, who, as they boarded American ships into the unknown, still believed that it was all theater, until they looked inside the ship. May 1943. In the sweltering heat of Tunisia, the African front finally collapses under the weight of Allied logistical superiority. In just 6 days, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers surrender, among them thousands of health professionals, doctors, surgeons, pharmacists, assistants, and at least a few dozen DRK nurses. They had served on the Afrika Korps for nearly 2 years, following Rommel's advances and retreats across the desert. Operating in dusty tents without stable electricity, rusty syringes, and repurposed bottles of expired anesthetics. For many, that moment represented not only the loss of a campaign, but the first crack in conviction. When they were led to the collection points organized by the Allies, they expected at the very least humiliation and neglect. They received the opposite. In less than 12 hours after capture, American medical teams individually evaluated each German health worker. Based on the norms of the Geneva Convention, they decided that those with greater clinical experience would continue to perform their functions, not as passive prisoners, but as caregivers under supervision. The remainder would be evacuated to the rear. It was during this process that the first exposure to American medicine happened, and the impact was immediate. At the triage camp in Tunis, the nurses were directed to an American surgical structure set up in record time. Climate-controlled tents, 24-hour generators, uniform electric lighting, sterile tables, mobile X-ray units, greenhouses with antibiotics organized in drawers labeled by date and type. Some stopped at the entrance. "Is this a hospital?" asked one of them. Others just watched, in silence. The contrast was aggressive. On the African line, the Germans improvised medical camps with hanging sheets, boiled metal basins on stoves, and diagnostics based on touches and looks. The idea of a portable X-ray working in the desert dust seemed like fiction until they saw the images developed in minutes projected on metal supports, read aloud by an American doctor without hesitation. The surprise came not only from the technology, but from the organization. The procedures followed written protocols, medication tables, and infection control maps. Each patient was typed, catalogued, and monitored by a system of colored cards. In German field hospitals, the only identification of a wounded person was often the uniform itself. At the Enfidaville outpost, the Americans installed a functional blood transfusion station in less than 48 hours, something that most Reich civilian hospitals could not maintain even in urban areas. Nazi practice still relied on direct, body-to-body transfusions that were risky and prone to failure. The American system, on the other hand, was based on refrigerated bags, frozen plasma stock, cross-compatibility, and safe administration in the field. It was there, among white tents and stockpiles of penicillin, that doubt began to take shape. What if everything they had learned about the enemy's weakness was wrong? The Liberty ships, which transported some of the captured medical personnel to the United States, were another revelation. Mass-produced in record time, they symbolized the industrial strength of a country that, unlike Germany, did not need to invade territories to manufacture steel, glass, or antibiotics. Inside these vessels, the medical wards were equipped with ventilation systems, constant electric lighting, and pharmaceutical repositories stocked with a variety of drugs that most German nurses knew only by name. In a statement collected years later, one of them would confess, "It was like entering a hospital of the future, but that was their gift." For professionals trained under the belief that American medicine was amateurish, watching a surgeon operate with disposable scalpels was as disconcerting as watching a technician collect urine samples with portable labeled sealed test kits. The war they knew was made up of scarcity, improvisation, and resistance. The war that the Americans were waging was made up of protocols, science, and production on a large scale. In July 1943, the first groups of German doctors and nurses landed on American soil for triage. In Norfolk, they were met by naval officers who strictly complied with prisoner-of-war humanitarian standards. But the shock wasn't in the hospitality, it was in the routine. There, each prisoner received complete medical examinations, dental treatment, adjustment of corrective lenses, vaccination. This level of care was not even guaranteed to German civilians in the large cities of the Reich. It was an inversion of the world. The enemy treated them better than the regime itself. In the following months, they would be taken by train to hospital centers in the interior of the country, and what they would see on these trips would transform their beliefs even more profoundly, because each city crossed revealed something that no propaganda could hide. The United States was not just winning the war. Science, medicine, and the ability to keep lives standing were winning. In Richmond, they saw the Medical College of Virginia. In Philadelphia, the imposing blocks of the General Hospital. In Washington, the American Red Cross entered the wagons to distribute packages of soap, cigarettes, and notebooks to prisoners. The silence between them only increased. What for the Germans was a struggle for survival, for the Americans was a matter of process. And in the next chapter, this process will become an avalanche, because they had not yet known the most devastating weapon in American medicine, penicillin, and what this antibiotic would do before his eyes, and in front of his certainties, would mark the beginning of a conversion with no return. The first time a captured German nurse saw a soldier with gangrene retrieve the limb was at the field hospital of the 21st U.S. Army in Normandy. The wound was serious, advanced necrosis in the left thigh, darkened tissue, foul odor, persistent fever. In Germany, fate would be inevitable, immediate amputation, perhaps death from septicemia. But there, before his eyes, an American doctor ordered the administration of intravenous penicillin for 4 days straight. At the end of the treatment, the dead tissue had been controlled, the infection contained, and the limb had been saved. For her, that was impossible. And yet, it was happening. Penicillin was no longer a laboratory experiment. It was routine. The drug that Alexander Fleming had identified by chance in 1928, but which the Germans considered unfeasible for mass production, had become, in the hands of American industry, the most decisive, invisible weapon of the conflict. In 1943, the United States produced 21 billion units of the substance. By 1945, the number had jumped to 6.8 trillion. For comparison, German production in that same period was so limited that the use of penicillin was reserved for high-ranking officers or selective experiments. In the surgical fields of the Reich, amputation was safer than waiting for an infection to evolve. In American hospitals, amputation was the exception, and saving was the norm. The nurse's shock was not only in the numbers, but in the banality with which the antibiotic was administered. It was a medical supply present in each ward, distributed unceremoniously. The vials were stacked in boxes with expiration dates, dosing instructions, batch labeling. American doctors spoke of penicillin pragmatically, as if it were a syringe or a thermometer. But for those Reich professionals, the mere existence of such vast stocks was already a cognitive rupture. Germany, in the last years of the war, could not even secure enough aspirin for its civilian hospitals. In many cases, old antibiotics like sulfadiazine were diluted to yield more, and even sulfur dust, a primitive product, was rationed to the extreme. The statistics speak for themselves. In just 3 years, the United States multiplied its production of penicillin by more than 1,000 times, based on an industrial model that combined university laboratories, private pharmaceutical companies, and unrestricted support from the federal government. It was a scientific mobilization on a national scale, while Germany divided its few resources between war, propaganda, and racial ideology. The impact was physical, but also moral. Penicillin saved not only Allied soldiers, but also prisoners, wounded civilians, even captured Germans with critical infections. No racial screening, no purity criteria, no biological value was considered. Whoever needed it, received it. It was, for Nazi nurses, the greatest demonstration of moral weakness possible, and at the same time the greatest sign of technological strength. The enemy, who according to his manuals was degenerate and without honor, not only won, he healed, and he did it abundantly. In the field, this meant that while a German hospital used a single vial of penicillin with extreme care for weeks, Americans could discard the empty vial and start the next treatment within minutes. The drug was just one cog in a much larger system, a medical industrial ecosystem where logistics, science, and standardization allowed life to be efficiently preserved. In interviews recorded after the war, some of these nurses confessed that they did not even know how to apply penicillin systematically. They had heard in internal DRK meetings that the British were trying to use it, but that it was unstable, too expensive, and with uncertain side effects. Discovering that the enemy not only mastered the technique, but distributed the product on a war scale, as feed, as fuel, was as impactful as seeing a B-17 bomber flying with a destroyed half-wing. It was the symbol of structural superiority. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a crumbling belief system. This perception was reinforced when nurses began to realize that American doctors did not protect penicillin as a strategic secret. On the contrary, they explained their action naturally, offered demonstrations, shared protocols, let the prisoners watch the proceedings. A doctor at the 45th Evacuation Hospital once told a German nurse, "This is not a war advantage, that's what medicine should be." The phrase was recorded in the military report, and the nurse's response too, "In Germany, we would be punished for suggesting such treatment without authorization from the hierarchy." Because there was the difference. While the Americans promoted a decentralized empirical medicine aimed at efficiency and saving lives, Nazi medicine had become a ritual of obedience. Technique subordinated to ideology. Science subordinated to race. Penicillin, then, was not just an antibiotic. It was a world divider. It represented the ability to transform knowledge into production, production into logistics, logistics into salvation. It was proof that medicine did not need to choose between science and morals. He could, and should, serve both. And for the nurses who grew up hearing that the Reich was the last stronghold of modern medicine, it was a quiet humiliation. One of the prisoners would write years later in a notebook kept at Camp Opelika, Alabama, "Penicillin did more than heal wounds. She curated ideas, because when we saw German soldiers, our soldiers, being saved by her, there was no longer any way to say that the enemy was inferior. But even that impact was still only the surface, because what they did not expect, what no German propaganda had even considered, was that these cures would often be conducted by hands that the Reich itself considered unfit to practice medicine, hands that carried the wrong color, the wrong origin, the wrong sex, hands that, according to his doctrine, should never be in a position of authority. And that's what they'll see next. Because after penicillin, black nurses would come, and with them would come the collapse of the last layer of ideology. In the summer of 1944, German nurses who had been transferred to medical centers in the interior of the United States began to occupy basic functions in the hospitals under surveillance. They expected to find there what they knew, a rigid hierarchy, top-down orders, evident racial distinction. Instead, they entered surgical wards led by black women, in uniform, respected, with clinical authority and absolute technical mastery. The impact was immediate, not just because they are women, but because they are black. In the doctrine in which they had been trained, black women should not even receive medical training, much less teach, lead, or correct Europeans. But that's exactly what happened. At Camp Florence, Arizona, Lieutenant Eleanor Powell was in charge of an entire orthopedic recovery ward, and not only supervised German nurses, but corrected them with surgical precision. Her presence was no exception. It was part of an American military policy that, even though segregated, had assigned hundreds of African-American nurses to care for prisoners of war, including the Reich. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. In the wards overseen by Powell, the Germans saw practices they never imagined: infection control protocols, standardized nursing reports, accurate blood pressure measurements with modern equipment, inventory management with daily inventory, and all under the leadership of a woman who, according to their ideology, could never even touch them. Some refused orders in the first few days. They were relocated or warned. Others quietly began to learn. The moral authority was clear. Whoever mastered knowledge led, and Powell dominated. At Glennon General Hospital in Oklahoma, the same phenomenon was repeated. Entire infirmaries operated under the management of black officers, men and women, who acted with absolute competence. In the minds of the Nazi nurses, this didn't make sense. The racial ideology of the Third Reich taught that there was a natural order among peoples, and that blacks occupied the base of this pyramid. The American experience forced them to confront not a statistical error, but a complete bankruptcy of thought. It was impossible to deny what they saw. The technical leadership of these professionals was evident, as was the tranquility with which white colleagues treated them in the medical environment. There was no tension, only focus. When they discreetly questioned why black nurses were in a position of command, the answer they heard from an American doctor was direct: because they are the best at it. And they were. Trained by schools such as the Freedmen's Hospital School of Nursing in Washington and rigorously trained by the armed forces, these women had overcome not only racial exclusion, but the technical requirement of a system that did not admit mistakes in the field. Each wrong medication could cost a life. Every hesitation in screening could mean an avoidable amputation, and even under the official segregation of the U.S. Army, these professionals had conquered their space, with excellence. The emotional break for the Germans was twofold. First, to see that his enemy was more technically advanced, then to discover that this advance was supported by people whom his doctrine considered inferior. This dissonance spread silently through the corridors of hospitals. There were no protests, no confrontation, just silence. A kind of shame that could not be admitted, but neither could it be denied. When an African-American nurse demonstrated how to regulate the pressure on a portable oxygen machine, something most Germans had never touched, there was no answer, only eyes that watched and hands that copied the gestures. Medicine required humility, not with speeches, but with precision. In the classified intelligence reports compiled by American officials in charge of monitoring the captured medical personnel, there are observations about the psychological impact of this contact. One of them reads, "The prisoners show initial resistance to the authority of black women, but this resistance seems to give way in the face of the practical need for learning." In another, daily exposure to African-American technical leaders seems to generate internal ruptures in the nurse's belief structure. It wasn't just technique, it was to confront, every day, a mistake that had shaped his identity. Racial ideology, taught from youth, now failed to get in touch with reality, and there was no way to unsee what they saw. In one case, recorded at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a German nurse wrote in her diary, "Today I was instructed by a Negro woman how to properly adjust the suction equipment. She had confidence in her gestures and firmness in her speech. I couldn't correct anything. I, who was trained not to touch hands like hers, now follow them to save lives." This simple phrase represents one of the greatest ideological victories of the Allies, because it was not conquered by force. It was conquered by competence, The war was being won in the factories, in the laboratories, on the battlefields, but it was also being defeated in the illuminated corridors of military hospitals, where knowledge overrode prejudice and scientific logic replaced racial dogma. At the end of each shift, the German nurses knew that they had learned more from those enemies than from their entire training in the Reich, and they would learn even more, because in the coming months they would be transferred to large-scale units, where American medicine would show its most impressive face. The hospital as an assembly line for healing, with thousands of patients, automated logistical flows, and resources that not even Berlin had in 1940. And there would be no way to feign ignorance anymore. What was to come was not just more medicine, it was the ultimate entry into a world where efficiency served everyone, including the enemy. Upon landing in medical centers in the interior of the United States, the German nurses expected to find an extension of what they had already seen in field hospitals: superior organization, good equipment, competent doctors, but they were not prepared for what came next. In facilities such as Glennon General Hospital in Oklahoma or the 21st General Hospital in Ravenel in occupied France, medicine ceased to look like a science and began to behave like an industrial production line. The hospital was no longer a place of improvised help. It was a healing plant. American hospital structures operated with 500 to 2,000 active beds, divided into wings, with duplicated wings for infectious cases, orthopedics, psychiatry, and neurological recovery. In a single complex, there were more operating theaters than most university hospitals in all of Germany. The comparison wasn't just embarrassing, it was absurd. While the Reich reorganized damaged buildings to serve civilians with electricity shortages and reused sheets, Americans built entire hospitals from scratch, equipped with autonomous generators, internal transportation lines, refrigerated warehouses, and laboratories for real-time biochemical testing. At every corner, a new wound in the doctrine of German superiority. In the central pharmacies of these hospitals, the prisoners found stocks organized with military precision. Hundreds of medicines, all stored by therapeutic class, with expiration labels and logistical tracking codes. The environment was air-conditioned, and part of the supplies were under controlled refrigeration, a luxury unthinkable in most medical facilities in Germany. Ampoules, syrups, antibiotics, anesthetics, and even vitamins in capsules, all available in sufficient quantity to sustain large-scale operations for months. In Germany, rationing was already reaching even university hospitals. The Reich had lost access to several raw material routes, and synthetic substitution was slow, expensive, and ineffective. At the height of the conflict, some German regions operated without basic sedatives, forcing doctors to improvise with saline solutions and morphine diluted in alcohol. In the USA, the practice was the opposite. When faced with an expired bottle, the protocol was simple: discard and replace. But what most impressed the German nurses was not only the existence of these resources, but the pace with which they were used. They were accustomed to scarcity as the norm, to waste as a crime, to improvisation as a method. In the American system, waste was acceptable as long as efficiency was preserved. If a bandage fell to the floor, it was discarded. If a needle bent slightly, it went into the disposal box. If a medicine passed one day of its expiration date, it was changed. To professionals trained in the rigidity of the war economy, that scenario seemed like science fiction. But it was just the daily life of the American medical machine. The surgical centers worked in continuous shifts, teams took turns, instruments were sterilized in autoclaves with timed cycles, and beds were rotated according to recovery protocols. There was coordination between wards, technical supervision by specialized nurses, and even psychologists on standby for combat trauma patients. It was integrated, massified, and scientific medicine, something that Nazi medical doctrine never considered building. Because for the United States, the war was a logistical equation, and in medicine, this translated into a system that treated thousands, with flow control, guaranteed input, and constant specialization. There was no improvisation. There was scale. The emotional shock for the prisoners came in layers. First, when he saw that a working system was possible. Then by understanding that the enemy, who his beliefs swore was disorganized, weak, mestizo, and chaotic, operated with more discipline, more control, and more results than the Reich itself. It was a deep blow. A German nurse wrote in her diary, later filed in Campo Pellicer records, "In Germany we were taught that America was noisy, sloppy, soulless. But here, everything works like gears. They are like healing factories." And they were. The integrated laboratories of these hospitals processed tests in a few hours. Blood counts, bacterial cultures, liver function tests. The result was typed, filed, and delivered to the doctor with a standardized treatment recommendation. A process that in Germany took days if there were reagents available. American industrial production had even turned medical science into an operational routine. This is what the Germans could not understand at first. How could a country that had no millennial tradition in medicine, as they learned, now dominate all stages of modern clinical practice? The answer was harsh, but clear. Germany had invested in ideological purity. The United States has invested in standardization, applied science, and production at scale. The result was simple. While the Reich was sinking into eugenics and the cult of heroism, America standardized the use of the stethoscope, automated plasma production, multiplied access to penicillin, and built hospitals on rails. Yes, rails. Some mobile hospitals with more than 30 wagons operated on exclusive railway lines, taking surgery, pharmacy, and hospitalization to the most critical points. None of this was part of the mental map of the DRK nurses, and all of this was now before his eyes. American medicine was in fact an industry, but not a cold or automatic industry. It was an industry with a purpose: to save, to recover, to restore, including one's own enemies. For those prisoners, with each room they entered, a certainty died, and in the next chapter another illusion would fall to the ground. Because more than resources, more than protocols, more than hospitals on rails, what the Reich nurses would see next was what the Americans did with what the Nazis discarded: the weak. And there, inside the wards, the ideological collapse would be total. At first it seemed like a mistake, an oversight by a nursing assistant or a poorly executed protocol. A surgical forceps, still functional, were thrown away. A bottle of morphine with 1 milliliter remaining was discarded. A bandage that had fallen on the floor was not rescued, but replaced. Afterwards, a tray of meals returned to the kitchen with half of the food untouched. To the German nurses, none of this made sense. In Germany, nothing was wasted. Each instrument was washed, boiled, reused until corrosion. Bandages were rinsed by hand and hung up to dry. Expired medicines were extended with chemical improvisation. Syringes sterilized with wood and reused until the plunger cracked. In American military hospitals, the procedure was clear. Disposable material was literally discarded. Not out of arrogance, not out of ostentation, but because there was more. There was always more. That little detail, what was thrown away, became a devastating psychological symbol, because it wasn't just what Americans wore, it was what they could afford to lose. A DRK nurse captured on the African front and transferred to Glennon Hospital wrote, "They throw away more syringes in a day than we get in a week. That's it," with a smile on his face. It was true. And this truth opened deep cracks in the professional pride of the prisoners. American medicine didn't just work better. It was so plentiful that protocols systematically included disposal. The impact of this culture went beyond technique. To the Germans, who were trained in a system of permanent scarcity, where even the suture thread was counted, the sight of piles of gloves discarded after a single surgery seemed heresy. But they soon realized it was not heresy, it was protocol. And the American protocol prioritized safety, efficiency, and infection control, based on data, not improvisation. While the Reich kept alive dogmas of heroism and sacrifice, the United States invested in sterility, predictability, and volume. A cold approach, perhaps, but that was precisely what saved the most lives. And what shocked the nurses was that this supposed waste produced more healing than all the disciplined effort of Nazi medicine. Food was another point of confrontation. In American military mess halls, each prisoner was given balanced meals: meat, vegetables, dessert. The amount far exceeded German military rations, and some of that food returned to the kitchen intact. For German women accustomed to sharing a piece of bread among 3 people in field hospitals, that level of abundance was inconceivable. Some even hid portions as a conditioned reflection of scarcity. Others watched in silence as American soldiers threw away what in Germany would have been a luxury meal. And for the first time they felt no anger. They felt powerless. The garbage, which was previously just debris, became a document. The American discard can said more about the war than any bulletin from the German High Command, because what the Americans threw away naturally represented what the Germans were fighting to achieve. It was the visual translation of a logistical abyss, of a war won not only with bullets but with supply chains. The Reich could have tanks and soldiers, but he had no way to sustain his healthcare system, not even for his own men. And here comes the final irony of this block. What the prisoners saw was not an offense to medicine. It was the portrait of a state and industrial machine capable of providing massive care with a standard of security on a continental scale. American hospitals discarded it because they could replace it, because they manufactured enough for security to come before the economy. While in Germany austerity was celebrated as a moral virtue, in the United States, efficiency was measured by lives saved, not by how many syringes were repurposed. The American solution was brutal in its simplicity. Produce more than you consume, never operating at the limit. That pile of disposables, that half-full plate, that tongs left in the discard tray, all of these images became mental obsessions for the DRK prisoners because they slowly destroyed the moral basis of everything they had learned. And the question that began to arise silently in each of them was uncomfortable. If they can waste all this, and they still heal more, so what were we doing? The answer would come soon, because next these same nurses would witness something that Nazi propaganda could never have anticipated. Christmas, but not theirs. The Christmas offered by their enemies. A gesture so absurd, so contradictory to everything they had learned, that no instrument, no medicine, no hospital would have more impact than that. The next shock would not be technical. It would be human. In American hospitals, it wasn't just the technology that impressed. It was the one who operated it. For German nurses, accustomed to a rigid, hierarchical, militarized structure, the behavior of American nurses was an enigma. They did not passively await orders. They discussed, suggested, disagreed. An American nurse had the authority to oppose a doctor, to review protocols, to refuse practices she deemed unsafe. This professional autonomy was seen, at first, as insubordination. But it soon turned out to be something more, a structural pillar of a more efficient, more ethical, and more humane medical model. Under Nazi doctrine, the role of the nurse was defined by two principles: obedience and sacrifice. The ideal professional was the one who complied, kept silent, and endured. Trained under this code, many of the prisoners had never been taught to think critically about their practice. And now, inside the Allied hospitals, they discovered that true prestige did not come from silence, but from decision. An American nurse could identify a failure, fill out conduct reports, propose hygiene protocols. He was responsible for lives, yes, but also for the decisions that saved them. And the difference was palpable. In clinical meetings, nurses gave their opinion on cases. In surgeries, they alerted to vital signs, questioned dosages, and participated in pain management. In training sessions, they were encouraged to ask, to study, to improve. It was scientific nursing, driven by data and ethics, not by ideology or submission. And this contrast deeply shook the professional identity of the prisoners, because it revealed that Allied medicine was not only more advanced in resources, it was more advanced in mental structure. I thought more, listened more, healed more. Captain Helen Morrison of Glennon Hospital summed up this philosophy for new nurses in training. You are responsible for the results. If something is wrong, you speak up, regardless of who's above you. For Germans who came from a regime where dissenting was a crime, this phrase was revolutionary, but also logic, because in American hospitals, saving the patient was more important than preserving hierarchy. At the Opelika prison camp, Alabama, DRK nurses were included in technical training alongside American women. They watched simulations, manipulated equipment, debated protocols. They found that the practice of documentation was central. Everything was recorded, reviewed, audited. Failures were corrected based on evidence, not punishment. And the more they learned, the more they realized that this system did not depend on blind obedience. It depended on capacity. In one of the internal reports of the U.S. Army, dated February 1944, the following statistic is recorded. 92% of American nurses trained between 1942 and 1943 received complete clinical training with technical specialization, while in Germany the number was no more than 27%, and this total even included professionals destined only for civilian wards. This discrepancy in training revealed something deeper. The US was preparing specialists, while the Reich was training obedient auxiliaries. If this difference surprised you, comment below. Shocking data. Gradually, the pride of the prisoners gave way to doubt. If the American medical structure worked better, saved more, and still gave autonomy to women, so why was the German model taught as superior? This restlessness grew at every turn, and it touched not only the technique, but the identity. Because to accept that the American nurse was more effective was to admit that her own training had been limited, purposely limited. This autonomy also brought something new: respect. Doctors listened to their nurses. Officers consulted reports written by them. Teamwork wasn't a metaphor, it was routine. And this respect generated efficiency. Fewer errors, more infection control, more recovery. Silent obedience, which in Germany was a symbol of honor, was a risk there. Questioning saved, and this was taught. Formally, technically, ethically. But there was something even more disconcerting: the way in which this autonomy transformed the very view of women. In the Reich, the function of women was to serve, to the fatherland, to the soldier, to the race. In American nursing, women thought, led, cared, but with science, with decision, with independence. The prisoner, who had previously seen her profession as an extension of the war effort, now began to see it as a mission of conscience. Nursing was no longer a sacrifice and became a choice, and that, for someone who was trained never to choose, was a revolution. This abyss between the two models became even more evident in 1945, when prisoners began to integrate infirmaries under direct American supervision. They applied American protocols, filled out American forms, used American antibiotics, and under these conditions, for the first time, they saw patients improve faster, fewer sequelae, and more safety. There was no longer any denying it. American medicine not only had more resources, it had better foundations. At the end of one of these shifts, a German nurse confided to an American officer, "In Germany, I was just hands. Here, I need to be a head." This phrase summarizes the change, because it revealed the collapse of a model based on obedience and the discovery of a thinking, scientific, critical nursing, and it was just the beginning. Because then these same professionals would be taken to an even more brutal shock, something that did not concern technique nor autonomy, but to the story they swore was not true: photographs, testimonies, documents, and the final revelation, what Reich medicine had helped to cover up. For the DRK nurses captured in French camps or taken from the makeshift hospitals of the African front, the idea of dignified treatment of the enemy was absurd. They grew up hearing that Americans were weak, decadent, sunk in capitalist selfishness and moral degeneracy. And yet here were their own soldiers, Wehrmacht men, torn uniforms and exhausted looks, receiving not only morphine, antibiotics, and hot food, but something they didn't even expect: respect. American doctors did not scream, they did not humiliate. They applied anesthesia, asked about pain, offered clean blankets. They called the prisoners by name. In some wards, chaplains entered to console the dying Germans, praying in a low voice, often in German. What the Nazi regime had taught as humanitarian weakness was now revealed as a disarming force. The most striking accounts came from sick prisoners in recovery. Penicillin, until then a rumor among Germans, was routinely applied. Soldiers who, in Nazi field hospitals, would be amputated or left for dead, now rose again with intact limbs, infections under control, and teeth treated. Each cure belied years of indoctrination. The nurses, forced to attend the process, could not deny the results. One of them later wrote, "If they are weak, why do their patients live longer?" The breaking point was not only technical, but moral. Alongside American and even African American nurses, these prisoners began to witness a type of medicine that did not select, did not hierarchize, did not segregate. It was practical and at the same time ethical, and this ethic extended to his own countrymen. American doctors explained procedures to prisoners. They asked if they were ready. They were waiting for consent. The idea that a doctor or nurse could listen to the patient, even if he was a war enemy, challenged the basis of Nazi medicine, in which the soldier's body was a state tool. The Germans were given balanced meals, portions equal to those of American soldiers, regular baths, changed clothes, soap, toothpaste. In some camps, they even organized moderate physical activities for the wounded. Patient care was systemic. It was no exception. It was politics. And this generated a silent crisis in the prisoners, because what they were seeing was not just medicine, it was an idea of a world that worked without having to eliminate the weak. At a military hospital in Oklahoma, a German nurse named Annalisa watched as an American doctor corrected an inmate who mocked a wounded German prisoner. The officer said clearly, "He is our patient, not our enemy." This simple phrase resonated like an ideological earthquake. In Germany, prisoners were treated as objects. In the US, they were given dignity, even those who had fired on American soldiers days before. The irony is that this American stance not only did not weaken its hospitals, it made them more efficient. The morale of the patients increased. Cooperation among the prisoners improved. Infection and complication rates were lower. The system not only looked more human, it was in fact more functional. And this functionality was the final blow to the Nazi logic of force over compassion. Gradually, the nurses began to record these experiences. Diaries were filled with notes that mixed bewilderment and admiration. I received instructions to take care of an American soldier and a German, both with pneumonia. Same medication, same protocol, same blanket. Another account describes a waiting room in which German prisoners waited side by side with Italian civilians, wounded American soldiers, and even Red Cross workers. No barrier, no segregation, only the queue, organized in order of arrival and clinical severity. In September 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Misch's report detailed that more than 2,300 prisoners of war had been treated in U.S. hospitals with a recovery rate of over 85%. And the most impressive data, less than 1% of these calls recorded any disciplinary incident. When treated as humans, the prisoners collaborated. When listened to, they respected. And this detail revealed more than American goodwill. It revealed a system of warfare that, even in combat, still managed to maintain civilizing principles. A silent but absolute victory. The impact on the nurses was not immediate, but it was cumulative. Every gesture contradictory to their training, every practice of care extended to the enemy, eroded the foundations of what they had learned in the classrooms of the Reich, because what was taught as weakness was now the strength that most confused. But he disarmed, more converted. In one of the post-war interrogations, a German nurse summed up the contradiction. "I expected bars. I found clean curtains." This apparently simple phrase carries a dense symbolic charge, because it exposes the true antagonism of this story, not between countries but between ideas. The Reich believed that dignity was a luxury for those who have already won. The Americans showed that it was the basis of those who intend to win, and it is precisely when this belief begins to crumble that the most brutal shock approaches, because until now, nurses were just unlearning. But in the next stage, they would be forced to look at what they never wanted to see, what Nazi medicine had allowed, omitted, and in many cases, carried out. Photographs, reporting, numbers, and testimonies coming from fields where medicine did not save but killed. This revelation would forever change not only his understanding of war, but of medicine itself. In the winter of 1943, as Europe froze under the shrapnel of war, an unusual silence hung over POW camps across the United States. The fences were still there, the guards were still patrolling, but inside the living quarters something almost impossible for indoctrinated minds happened. Christmas trees were set up. In the hands of German nurses, women trained to expect punishment, retaliation, and humiliation. Packages came from the other side of the fence. Scented soaps, chocolates, letters written by American Boy Scouts. Some carried phrases such as "Merry Christmas, even if we are on opposite sides." In local churches in Alabama, children sang Christmas carols in German. The prisoners, uniformed in neutral field attire, were invited to listen. And there, in the land of the enemy, they heard the same songs that rocked their childhood. No threats, no advertising, no uniforms with swastikas, just children's voices singing about peace and forgiveness. At Camp Alva, Oklahoma, assigned to the captured medical personnel of the Afrika Korps, a table was set for supper. Roast turkey, vegetables, potatoes, pies, in generous portions. It was not a theatrical farce, it was the real menu, replicated in hundreds of camps, as part of a humanitarian policy coordinated by the American Red Cross and approved by the military high command. Next to the supper, Christmas cards, some hand-drawn by American families who had children on the European front. The irony was palpable. The enemy treated with charity the women who represented a regime that sent bombs over London. An American soldier summed it up like this: "It's Christmas, and today even the enemy is only human." For the German nurses, this was not just unexpected, it was disconcerting. From their formation, they had been instructed that the enemy was savage, corrupt, anti-Christian. Nazi propaganda had constructed the Allies as demons dressed as soldiers. And yet, here were the Americans themselves, respecting German traditions, handing out gifts, allowing masses in German and, most absurdly, offering respect. What should have been the most humiliating period of their lives became, paradoxically, the most peaceful since the beginning of the war. And it was in this contrast that the ideological collapse gained strength. Because violence can be rationalized, the brutality can be attributed to the war. But kindness, the deliberate kindness of the enemy, here breaks logic. The nurses had been trained to endure interrogations, scarcity, pain, but they were not prepared for forgiveness. In an internal Red Cross report from January 1944, a note describes, "The prisoners wept during the distribution of gifts, not out of nostalgia but out of shame." American medicine, until then perceived only as superior in technology, was beginning to reveal itself also superior in purpose. And that was the most painful blow. Nazi doctrine held that the weak must be eliminated in order for the race to thrive. But now, they were living in a reality where even the enemy, even defeated, even captured, was given dignity. How to reconcile this with the idea that the Reich was the beacon of civilization? How to justify learned contempt if the despised offered compassion? At Fort Robinson, Nebraska, an educational experiment was started after Christmas. German nurses participated in lectures on medical ethics, patient rights, and modern scientific practices. They were invited to debate, to question, to think, freedoms that did not exist in the Reich medical institutes. The rooms had no posters of Hitler. They had anatomical charts, microscopic slides, scientific articles. One wrote, "For the first time, I was taught that I can disagree without being punished." It wasn't just a class. It was an internal reconstruction. The American Christmas thus became a watershed, not only because it offered warmth and food, but because it offered a choice: maintain belief in an ideology based on hatred, or accept that there was something fundamentally more humane and more effective on the other side of the wall. It was the beginning of a slow but irreversible process. Ideology did not fall with gunfire, dropped Christmas cards and chocolate powder. And while the Christmas bonfires went out in the fields of the United States, the psychological impact persisted, because when they returned to the wards, when they saw prisoners treated as patients, when they remembered the Christmas carol of enemy children, an uncomfortable question remained: if those were the barbarians, who were they? But the biggest revelation was yet to come, because up to that moment, the prisoners had only witnessed the compassion of the enemy. They had not yet faced the shadow of their own past. They had not yet been confronted with the documents, the images, the testimonies that would show where Nazi medicine had really taken the world. The moral collapse would be complete, not in the face of the kindness of others, but in the face of the cruelty they had served. And when these tests arrived, there would be no going back. The next chapter would reveal what they saw and what they decided to do with it. While the war was still raging in Europe on the other side of the Atlantic, another kind of operation was taking place: silent, strategic, and with lasting effects. It did not involve tanks nor pitched battles. It was conducted in makeshift classrooms, university auditoriums, and American infirmaries, where German prisoners of war, many of them nurses from the Afrika Korps, were introduced to a new curriculum, an invisible curriculum. Most had arrived at the camps in the United States expecting interrogation and constant surveillance. Instead, they were given medical manuals, evening classes, and debates on topics that had never been allowed in their Nazi formations. Medical ethics, patient consent, the scientific method as the basis of the clinic. Discussions that seemed innocent hid the largest silent re-education project of World War II. At the Opelika Field in Alabama and Fort Robinson, Nebraska, what began as technical reviews became a paradigm shift. The nurses attended lectures conducted by American medical officers, many of them former professors at colleges such as Johns Hopkins or Harvard, that presented concepts completely foreign to the medical doctrine of the Third Reich. One of them began his class by saying, "Here we don't treat organs, we treat people." It was a simple phrase, but for those women trained in the optics of state efficiency, genetic purity, and hierarchical obedience, it had the weight of a missile. Nazi medicine had not been neutral, it had been doctrinal. The manuals of the Reich taught that the doctor served the folk, the race, the national destiny, at most to biology. The idea of serving the individual, the patient, sounded at first glance like weakness. And yet, there they were receiving a new kind of training where compassion was taught as part of the technique. In a report dated March 1944, Colonel Richard Stevens, who was responsible for coordinating medical programs with prisoners of war, noted, "The most effective transformation is that which does not force anything. We give them knowledge, we let them think, and little by little, the old thinking crumbles on its own." Some nurses resisted, others were curious. One of them, identified in the records only as Schwester G, wrote, "We were never told that asking was allowed. Here they ask all the time, and the instructors smile when they answer." The classes also included practical sessions in hospitals within the camps, always supervised by American nurses. But now the hierarchy was reversed. Instead of commanding, they watched. Instead of leading, they learned. Each technical gesture was accompanied by clinical explanations. And each explanation has a scientific foundation. No slogans, no racial assumptions, only medicine, based on evidence, experience, and empathy. Gradually, these classes began to include topics that were forbidden in the Reich: human experimentation, forced euthanasia, compulsory sterilization. American instructors carefully revealed the ethical boundaries broken by Nazi medicine, not as a direct indictment, but as a historical warning. They used case studies, documented reports, letters from German doctors who colluded with the extermination programs, and they asked the disconcerting question, "If you were there, what would you have done?" The room was silent. There was no defense, only the weight of revelation. This method, more effective than any torture, created irreversible ideological cracks, because he did not treat the prisoners as guilty, but as professionals capable of learning and changing. It was not a trial, it was an offer. Knowledge as a bridge to a new role in the world, and for many of them this bridge was crossed. In September 1944, a group of 60 nurses received certificates of participation in advanced medical courses taught by the University of Nebraska Medical College. The document, simple and signed by civil authorities, had a phrase written in English and German, "For serving medicine, not power." The historical irony was evident. The women who had previously worn the uniform of the NS Frauenwerk, a symbol of Nazi female discipline, now held certificates issued by an American university, which recognized them not as prisoners, but as students. When they returned to the wards, they shared what they had learned. They began to question unnecessary orders. They suggested alternative methods. They asked for access to books, an invisible but growing change, and the Americans noticed. An Internal War Department memorandum of December 1944 stated, "The cooperation and discipline of German medical personnel increased in proportion to their educational exposure. There was no brainwashing, there was no imposition, it was silent pedagogy, a new mental model presented as a choice." And once again, American doctrine was not only superior in technology, it was superior in moral strategy. While the Reich built loyalty with fear, Americans deconstructed beliefs with knowledge. The ideological war was being won not on the battlefield, but in the classrooms of the prison camps. But the biggest test was yet to come, because until then, what the nurses had received was theory, clinical practice, and specific examples of another type of medicine, but there remained an open wound. What had the Reich done in the name of science? What crimes had been committed under the guise of medical care? The next stage of re-education would not come in the form of a class, but of irrefutable truth. Photographs, testimonials, videos, liberation from concentration camps, and the question that no one could avoid anymore. How far can medicine go when it loses its soul? It was in the midst of English-bound books and handouts translated by the Red Cross that the cruelest irony of the war began to take shape in the minds of German nurses. Among the names listed in chapters on physiology, pharmacology, and therapeutic advances were figures such as Dr. Otto Meyerhoff, Dr. Richard Willstetter, Dr. Hans Krebs, scientists whose research underpinned some of the modern medicine that now saved lives in American hospitals. Up to that point, these women had believed, with conviction, that the Third Reich was the pinnacle of science. But the truth presented itself with unquestionable dates, sources, and origins. Many of the advances attributed to the German genius had been conceived by Jewish scientists, expelled from Germany between 1933 and 1939. Hans Krebs, who had received the Nobel Prize for unraveling the metabolic cycle that bears his name, had been dismissed from his position in Freiburg for non-Aryan descent and had taken refuge in England, where he completed his research. Otto Warburg, whose work on cellular respiration inspired modern methods of fighting cancer, only survived in the Reich by Hitler's personal exception, but had his entire Jewish staff disbanded. Nurses now discovered that the medicine they saw saving limbs with penicillin, treating infections with sulfur drugs, and planning transfusions safely had been constructed in large part by minds the regime had declared undesirable. In one of the courses offered at the Fort Devens, Massachusetts camp, a university professor opened the class with a provocation: "You are alive because the science that the Reich destroyed has survived here." The silence was absolute. The names cited were the same ones that had been erased from Nazi manuals. American universities kept records, publications, and patents. The realization was brutal. The Reich had sabotaged medicine itself by expelling the brains that now fed the hospitals of the Allies. This revealing moment also turned into statistics. Between 1933 and 1941, more than 1,600 Jewish scientists, doctors, and researchers were removed from their positions in Germany. Of these, it is estimated that more than 300 were directly absorbed by American institutions, where they continued their research. The impact was incalculable. Allied medicine advanced, while Nazi medicine closed itself in a cult of racial purity, which did not cure, it only obeyed. For those who believed that the Reich was the scientific vanguard of the world, this reality was devastating. If this data also surprised you, comment below with the phrase, "Logistics wins." Because in the end, it wasn't just factories and supplies, it was ideas, preserved, welcomed, financed, that made all the difference. One of the nurses, identified as Irma K., wrote in her diary a revealing excerpt. "Today I learned that the transfusion method used here was created by a Jew whom my country expelled, and it is this method that saved the arm of a German soldier yesterday. I need more silence to understand this." This sense of ideological dislocation was slowly beginning to creep in. It was no longer possible to defend the rhetoric of superiority, because she was now belied not only by the facts, but by the lives saved, lives that they saw with their own eyes. Even more profound was the fact that this enemy medicine did not make a point of hiding its origins. The manuals had the names. Universities honored the authors. American science did not erase its dead. It celebrated its exiles. And it was precisely this recognition that most shook the Nazi logic, because the regime had taught that purity was superiority, but there, the persecuted impurity was the basis of healing. In the following weeks, new materials were distributed. The classes gained historical depth. They presented what had happened in German universities after 1933. They showed how libraries were censored, how professors were replaced by ideological loyalists, not scientists. Reich medicine had not evolved. It had stagnated, not for lack of patriotism, but for fear of the truth. And it was in this scenario that the ideological collapse of the prisoners began to take on a new tone: regret. Because it was not just a matter of recognizing that the enemy was more advanced. It was about acknowledging that the country itself had destroyed its future, based on a myth. The technology that now saved their lives, or the lives of their soldiers, had been marginalized, rejected, or exterminated by institutionalized racism. It was an open wound, and one that began to hurt more than any military defeat. But the wound was not yet complete. Until now, the nurses had read, listened, and learned. It remained to be seen. What would happen when the Allies liberated the death camps and revealed, to the world and to them, what Nazi medicine had really done? The next stage would not only bring irony, it brought horror, and a new question. How many of these women knew, and how many preferred not to? The scene unfolded in a military hospital in Virginia on an ordinary morning in 1944. German nurses walked silently through the corridors, their eyes trained to obey, their bodies erected by discipline, and their minds still trying to reconcile everything they were witnessing. In one of the infirmaries, a group of Axis prisoners were given dressings and antibiotics under the care of an American team. The atmosphere was calm, clean, efficient, but what captured all eyes was who was at the center of the medical team: Lieutenant Elena Powell, an African-American nurse with a firm voice and impeccable posture, who commanded the ward as if the world had no doubt about her authority. For the German prisoners, trained in a doctrine that associated skin color with biological inferiority, this was more than inconceivable. It was a collapse of the world. During a shift change, as she watched Powell arrange doctor's orders with surgical precision, one of the German nurses, hesitant, almost childish, muttered in a low voice, as if she couldn't believe her eyes, "How do you allow this?" The phrase pierced the air like a blade. There was no hatred in the question. There was astonishment. A doctrinal incredulity in the face of the breaking of a rule that, in its Nazi formation, was as fundamental as gravity. Powell paused, looked the prisoner straight in the eye, and replied with a firmness that didn't require a voice boost, "We allow it because here we treat human beings, not races." And then he went back to work, as if he hadn't just toppled an ideological empire with a single sentence. Elena Powell was no exception. He was part of a growing contingent of African-American professionals, both men and women, who were part of the U.S. military healthcare system. Many worked in mixed hospitals, including with Axis prisoners of war. The irony could not be greater. The same regime that exterminated lives based on pigmentation now saw its soldiers being saved by those they considered subhuman. The Reich had built its entire worldview on a racial pyramid, and now at the top of that inverted pyramid stood a black woman, surgical gloves in her hands, deciding who lived and how. Powell had advanced training in nursing, specializing in combat wounds. He led a team composed of white and black doctors, all under his technical command. He did not use his position to humiliate. He used it to teach. He corrected errors, gave guidance, explained procedures. Some German nurses resisted at first. They refused to follow her orders. They looked away. But the repetition of competence was inevitable. Each day the same patterns were repeated. Powell got it right. He coordinated. He solved. And the initial embarrassment turned into respectful silence. Then in shy questions, and finally in restrained admiration. The symbolic weight of this reversal was not just individual, it was civilizational. Nazi propaganda had painted the world as a fixed racial theater where each group had its eternal role. The Aryan whites ruled, the non-Aryans obeyed or were eliminated. But there, inside an American hospital, the entire stage was overturned. The professional who imposed authority, technique, and compassion was everything the regime had said was inferior, and he did it not to take revenge, but to heal. An internal report of the American Red Cross, dated April 1944, mentioned Powell's effectiveness in managing wings with Axis prisoners. The document used precise terms: unquestionable discipline, respect earned by competence, technical authority legitimized by the result. There was no ideology there. Data only, performance, result. And that was another shock for the Germans, the royal meritocracy. Not the Reich's empty talk about purity, but a system where professional value was measured by what you did, not by who you were. It is estimated that in 1944, more than 9,000 black nurses were active in the medical services of the United States Army. Among them, hundreds worked directly with prisoners of war. This number, practically non-existent in Germany, showed a reality that the Reich could never admit. Diversity did not only exist in the enemy, it worked. And it worked with brutal efficiency. One of the prisoners, named Anneliese, wrote in a note intercepted by the camp's censors, "I was never told what competence this color could have. I was always told it was impossible. Now, "I don't know what's impossible anymore." This type of statement became more common as the weeks progressed. Nazi racial doctrine was not being defeated by speeches. It was slowly being eroded by daily contact with reality that denied everything they had learned. And it is at this point that American power reveals its most forceful face. Because it was not enough to have more medicines, more hospitals, more technology. It was necessary to show that even the social structure was more flexible, more functional, more modern. The black nurse who commanded wards efficiently was, at heart, a symbol of a changing society. Not perfect, but moving. While the Reich sank into sterile purity, the United States grew with contradictions and with results. But this doctrinal collapse had even more layers, because it was one thing to see the racial hierarchy inverted in the countryside. Another was to discover that Nazi medicine itself had used science to destroy, while American medicine used science to restore. And this comparison would reach its apex when images and testimonies of the extermination camps began to arrive, because the next confrontation would no longer be with what the enemy did right, but with what the regime itself had done worse. While the Reich was unfolding strategies to plunder reserves of copper from Norway, tungsten from Spain, or synthetic rubber from Czechoslovakia, the United States supplied its hospitals with all these inputs, without crossing borders. No shots, no tanks, no generals were needed to ensure the constant flow of morphine, plasma, bandages, sterile syringes, or anesthesia valves. Everything came from home. From Pennsylvania to Texas, from California to Illinois, the American continent functioned as a logistical organism, where industry not only supplied the army, but anticipated it. The self-sufficiency of the Allies, especially the United States, was not rhetoric, it was statistics. In 1944, while Berlin received less than 40% of the hospital supplies requested by its own medical commands, an American field hospital set up in the French countryside was replenished in less than 72 hours with more than 800 different items, including 600 liters of refrigerated blood, freeze-dried penicillin, and disposable scalpels. This difference in speed and volume became evident to anyone who crossed the corridors of these facilities. Our German nurse, captured on the Italian front, noted with astonishment in her diary, "They have closed boxes of material that we have never used even once, and yet they open another one the next day, as if it didn't cost anything." It was not ostentation, it was scale. America had elevated war medicine to a factory function. Hospitals operated with logistical precision. Pharmacies received stocks by railway convoys, coordinated by radio systems. No hospital operations were interrupted for lack of gauze, glass, or sulfadiazine, while the Germans wounded soldiers without anesthesia, boiling reused syringes, lining wounds with steam-sterilized newspapers. American industry didn't just manufacture, it distributed. And he did it with mathematical intelligence. The medical quick requisition system, introduced in 1943, cross-referenced information on inventory, need, and transport logistics in real time. A mobile hospital of the 45th Infantry Division could, with a telegraph order, receive medical supplies in less than 3 days, even in the most unstable areas of the European front. The Reich, on the other hand, still operated with printed spreadsheets, weeks-long delays, and diverted transports for use by SS commandos. It was this invisible efficiency that began to dismantle the German myth of operational superiority. The Reich was not self-sufficient. He needed to conquer, pillage, improvise, and even so it failed. The rubber for the tires came from occupied Indochina, the copper of the circuits from Yugoslavia, aluminum from the north of France. Each new military victory was less a show of force and more a need for replacement. The United States, on the other hand, with less occupied territory and more factories on domestic soil, maintained a level of production that exceeded the sum of its allies and its enemies. In 1944, American plasma production exceeded Germany's by 12 times. The United States manufactured, in a single year, more sterile syringes than the Reich did in the entire war. This data is as impactful as it is revealing. While the Nazis invaded countries to produce war, the Americans produced so much that they did not need to invade anything. If this contrast impressed you, write in the comments, "absolute power," because that's exactly what the German nurses began to understand. It wasn't just a question of weaponry or strategy, it was structure. In the prison camps, some of them began to ask technical questions. They wanted to understand where so many materials came from. The answer was almost always the same: factories, dozens, hundreds, spread across the states of the North, the South, the Midwest. Each one specialized, each operating in 3 shifts. America didn't need the loot. It had industrialized care. He had organized the rescue as if it were ammunition, and this completely dismantled the logic of the German war effort. U.S. Army medical intelligence reports, kept on file to this day, reveal that the Allied command knew of the psychological impact this abundance caused. One of them states, "There is no need for propaganda when the patient sees his enemy being treated with equipment that his homeland has not even been able to manufacture." The power was not just in the bombs, but in the details: glass syringes that wouldn't crack, blood bags labeled by type, individual oxygen masks, chemical reactors that produced penicillin in real time on the battlefield. And perhaps the greatest logistical humiliation lay in a single fact. While German cities imploded under lack of supplies, an American hospital set up under tents on enemy soil had more pharmaceutical stock than the Central Hospital in Munich. The comparison was so absurd that it became a joke among Allied soldiers, but for the prisoner nurses, there was no laughter, there was disorientation, because this was an empire that he didn't need to conquer in order to dominate. He dominated because he produced, and he produced because he believed that lives deserved to be saved, even those of the enemy. But there was one kind of production that the Reich could never copy: the production of consciousness. The next revelation would not involve plasma, penicillin, or steel. It would involve memories, because some of those nurses had passed, even briefly, through military wings inside Germany, where voices whispered that Jewish patients were missing, and that doctors were silent. The next chapter would reveal that silence was not just a moral failing, it was part of the system, and the Americans were about to show it in detail. In April 1945, as the Allied armies crossed the gates of Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, a new front opened up. Not one of combat, but of consciousness. In the prison camps in the United States, German nurses, now captive for more than a year, received packages of censored correspondence, American newspapers, medical reports, and something that would change everything: photographs, raw black and white images, without retouching, with bodies piled up like wreckage, walking skeletons with empty eyes, operating rooms transformed into experimental chambers. At first, they doubted it. Then they rationalized. They said it could be a montage, propaganda, exaggeration, but the avalanche of evidence was indisputable. The Americans did not deliver pamphlets. They delivered reports. There were signatures of German doctors, internal memos, documented racial screening orders, sworn statements from survivors, and finally a letter, found in an SS officer's house, written by a German Red Cross nurse. She described with administrative coldness the application of morphine to sick children, with no prospect of usefulness to the Reich. It was there, between the lines of his own profession, that the collapse began. The prisoners, many still clinging to the idea that they didn't know anything, went through a new type of trial, the internal one. They began to wonder where they were when the first complaints emerged. They remembered patients who disappeared from the records, of doctors who never returned, of nurses removed without explanation, of muffled rumors in the corridors. Now, everything made sense, and the sense was unbearable. The medicine they swore to defend had been corrupted. The science they studied had been used to classify, discard, eliminate. And silence, the silence of each one of them, had been the fuel of this machine. The Americans did not demand confessions. They only showed the documents. They did not apply punishments. They just let the facts in. And perhaps this was the most effective punishment, forcing minds trained in obedience to process, on their own, the extent of guilt. Some prisoners asked to no longer work in the wards. Others fainted in front of films shown in closed sessions for German medical groups. One of them, upon seeing the Dachau scenes, is said to have whispered, "Now I understand why the wounded Germans were treated so well here. It was to show what we deny." The irony of this story is that the solution was before them all along. It was enough to hear, see, question. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts in depth, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to uncover these hidden layers of war, where the truth doesn't explode but wounds in silence. At one of the last screening sessions of seized medical documents, one of the prisoners who had previously taught anatomy in Leipzig asked the American captain, "Why are you showing us this now?" He replied, "Because the war is ending, and you need to know what you have done before you decide what you will be." This sentence left no room for escape, because it was not a question of punishment, but of choice. And for many of those women, the choice would never again be to serve an ideology, but rather human dignity. In the next part, the script will reveal what these women did after the war, and how American medicine, once seen as decadent, would become the new model they would come to study, imitate, and in some cases, adopt to reconstruct their own consciousnesses, because after the moral collapse, the redesign of identity would come. By the time the Reich officially surrendered in May 1945, for many of the prisoner nurses, the war had already ended weeks earlier, not on maps, but on convictions. The uniform, the oath, the flag, all of that had been deconstructed by the images of the camps, the clean corridors of American hospitals, the looks of black nurses who taught patiently and accurately. But what came next surprised even the most prepared. They would not be summarily deported, nor ostracized. They would be trained. The American strategy was clear. The battlefield was over. Now the field of reconstruction began. And these women, raised under a totalitarian regime, would become, ironically and by choice, key players in the reconstruction of a democratic Germany, inoculated against ideology. At military medical centers in the US and the United Kingdom, intensive courses began to be offered. Not only about technical nursing, but about public health, epidemic prevention, mass vaccination, basic sanitation, hospital management, and, above all, medical ethics. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard of patient consent. In Berlin, this expression was non-existent. In Chicago, it was the basis of everything. A former Luftwaffe nurse declared years later that the biggest shock was not penicillin or laboratories. It was the idea that a doctor could be sued for not listening to his patient. The classes were conducted by military personnel, but also by civilians. American universities sent volunteers. Public health organizations, such as the International Red Cross and the US Public Health Service, have created handouts translated into German. The objective was practical, but also symbolic. It was not just a matter of teaching procedures, but of planting a new vision of the world. Each class was a crack in the doctrinal foundation of Nazism. Where before there was absolute hierarchy, personal responsibility has entered. Where there was blind obedience, now professional conscience was discussed, and the impact was real. Some nurses wrote letters to their families saying they would return not as defeated but as transformed. One of them, recorded in the archives of the American Army, wrote, "I never imagined that I would be treated like a student and not like a criminal. Today I learned that hygiene is more than asepsis and its dignity." And that was the American plan. More than punishing, transforming, to train women who previously healed with ideological limits so that they now care with universality. It wasn't about charity, it was about moral strategy. Because the US didn't just want to win the physical war, it wanted to win the future. The nurses also participated in simulations of large-scale vaccination campaigns, learned about fighting tuberculosis, controlling typhus and syphilis outbreaks, and received manuals on how to set up regional health systems based on efficiency and access. While many imagined that the post-war period would be marked only by courts and trials, behind the scenes, a silent offensive was taking place, that of technical reconditioning. The Americans knew that by rebuilding Germany's medical infrastructure with these professionals, they would be inoculating the country with something stronger than penicillin, with values, and that included logistics. Part of the training involved the use of standardized forms, statistical inventory control, coordination between pharmacies and hospitals, and most importantly, the notion that access to medicine should be a public policy, not a racial privilege. In a short time, those women who previously screened patients by ethnicity began to calculate vaccine volumes by population density. The contrast was overwhelming and transformative. There was no triumphalist speech. No flag was raised at the end of the courses. Just a simple document signed by each nurse in which they committed to apply that knowledge not to the state, but to the people. A silent oath, but this time, free. And herein lies the final irony. The country they were taught to hate, which they said was weak, decadent, morally corrupt, was the country that invested the most in them, not as soldiers, but as human beings. The real American victory was not only logistical, industrial, it was ideological. The enemy was defeated without being destroyed. He was transformed. In the next part, we will look at what happened when these nurses returned to Germany, and how their attitudes, choices, and memories directly influenced the reconstruction of the health system of a country that, until then, had chosen eugenics as a path. Because the end of the war does not erase a past, but it can rewrite the future. When German nurses finally returned to occupied Germany, they found more than physical ruins. They found a devastated health system, destroyed hospitals, scarce supplies, and demoralized staff. But contrary to what Nazi propaganda predicted, these women did not return as submissive or guilty. They came back transformed. They carried with them not only advanced medical techniques, but an entire philosophy of patient-centered care. The lessons learned in American hospitals, classrooms, and prison camps now became concrete tools for rebuilding a country. They became invisible leaders, silent pioneers, able to reorganize wards, standardize protocols, and establish priorities that prioritized ethics over ideological efficiency. Each hospital rebuilt was living proof that compassion could be institutionalized and that science, when separated from politics, generated tangible results. In cities such as Munich, Frankfurt, and Hamburg, these nurses implemented screening systems that included detailed clinical records, hygiene protocols, correct administration of antibiotics, and judicious use of transfusions. They introduced the defense of the patient as a central principle, something unimaginable under the old regime. Nursing schools were founded or restructured following the models learned in the United States. Their methods, such as teaching based on clinical cases, ethical debates, practical supervision, and autonomy of students, replaced the old manuals of blind obedience. Each generation that passed through these institutions received not only technique, but awareness. The transmission of knowledge was twofold: skills and values, science and humanity. The logistical and technological impact was also felt. The nurses reorganized systems of stockpiling medicines and hospital supplies with the same American efficiency they witnessed in captivity. They established methods of blood storage, temperature control, strict labeling, and safe waste disposal, dramatically reducing infections and complications. Small gestures such as accurate recording of doses, daily observation of the patient, and judicious use of antibiotics marked the difference between ancient practices and the modern medicine they reconstructed. The contrast with the improvised methods of the Reich could not be greater. Where there had once been chronic shortages, there was now planning. Where there was once hierarchical centralization, there was now autonomy and accountability. Every nurse trained in the United States became, upon returning, a multiplier of knowledge. A single professional could train dozens of colleagues. Each school trained hundreds of students over the years. The ripple effect was exponential. American ethics in nursing, valuing the patient, respecting science, all spread throughout devastated Germany, forming an entire generation of professionals who were unaware of the racial ideology that had governed their previous education. The influence of these women was invisible but lasting. Even in hospitals that did not receive direct American supervision, the protocols and values they introduced remained in place, such as underground routes that support trees long after the storm passed. The changes were not limited to technique. The social perception of nursing has also evolved. Women are no longer seen only as obedient helpers to become thinking professionals, responsible for critical decisions. This redefinition of role had repercussions on social respect and the appreciation of public health. Moreover, the experience of having witnessed a medicine based on abundance and compassion left permanent marks on their daily practices. They would never again prioritize dogma over efficacy, nor hierarchy over patient well-being. Each clinical decision reflected the synthesis of what they had learned in American hospitals: rigorous science, efficient logistics, and unquestioned ethics. This invisible heritage has spanned decades. In the years following the war, West Germany rebuilt its hospital networks and nursing schools with a mindset that combined limited resources and strategic planning, inspired by American practices. Many hospital directors remembered the nurses trained in the United States as a benchmark of technical and moral excellence. They introduced continuing education methods, audits of safety procedures and protocols that still remain pillars of modern practice today. Every decision made by these women carried the memory of captivity, the lesson that medicine does not serve ideology but life. The legacy of these nurses can also be measured in numbers. It is estimated that between 1946 and 1960, nursing schools founded or reorganized by former American prisoners trained more than 10,000 professionals, many of whom became leaders in urban and rural hospitals. Each rebuilt hospital treated thousands of patients, multiplying the impact of the knowledge gained in the American fields. The transformation was not only technical, but cultural. Values of ethics, respect for diversity, patient advocacy, and professional autonomy were embedded in each class, in each protocol, in each clinical routine. In short, the generation that returned different didn't just apply what it learned. It rewrote the very identity of nursing in post-war Germany. American medical abundance, nurse autonomy, professional ethics, and efficient logistics have become tools of national reconstruction. What the Reich had tried to destroy with ideological indoctrination and eugenics now flourished in rebuilt hospitals, nursing schools, and daily clinical practices. The impact was profound, invisible, but lasting. Every patient treated under these principles was a silent witness to a moral victory that war could not measure on maps or tanks. And as these women continued to multiply knowledge, the inevitable realization emerged. What they had witnessed in the United States, which had transformed their own consciousnesses, was now the basis of a new Germany. But one question remained silent. Even with all the advances, would it be enough to erase the effects of a decade of indoctrination? The next part of the script will explore the consolidation of this legacy and how it intertwined with the broader reconstruction of German medicine, showing that the seed planted in American captivity germinated in ways that no one, not even Reich strategists, could have predicted. In the years following the end of World War II, researchers and historians began collecting accounts of former German nurses who had been prisoners in the United States. Among letters, diaries, testimonies, and interviews, one pattern stood out: the realization that the real lesson of war came not from weapons nor from military defeats, but from medicine. One phrase, repeated in different contexts and dates, summed up the complete transformation. "We served the Nazi regime, but we were healed by the Americans. Medicine has set us free." For these women, what seemed impossible, recognizing humanity in the enemy, had become evident through concrete actions: sterile bandages, precise transfusions, doses of penicillin administered without distinction, individualized attention, and ethical protocols that had never been contemplated in their original formations. Every gesture, every care, every medical procedure was a silent lesson, more eloquent than any history book, more impactful than any courtroom or surrender speech. The contrast between expectation and experience was dramatic. They arrived in the American camps accustomed to a system that prioritized race, utility, and blind obedience. Nazi doctrine taught that medicine should serve ideology, that bodies and minds should be shaped for a collective purpose, and that compassion could be sacrificed for the greater good of the Reich. But what they found in American hospitals was the complete antithesis: advanced technology, impeccable logistics, abundant supplies, and above all, a medical ethic based on human dignity and science. The practice transformed morale. Doctors and nurses treated prisoners and Allied soldiers with the same protocols. A wounded Wehrmacht soldier could receive the same care as an American, and none of it was questioned. The uniformity of treatment was not just technical, it was philosophy. The phrase that permeated all the reports was clear: medicine without hatred is stronger than any regime. This understanding did not happen immediately. Initially, there was disbelief, surprise, and in many cases, fear. The nurses observed transfusions, surgeries, and post-operative care performed efficiently and abundantly, and wondered about the rationality of an enemy that could produce so much, that could treat humanely those whom their own country classified as subhumane. An internal report from a former prisoner describes the feeling: "We didn't understand. How could they take care of our soldiers with such zeal if we were enemies?" And yet, that's exactly what happened, always, every day. The consistency of the practice, repeated and visible, created a cumulative effect. Every medical act became a moral argument. Every syringe, every application of penicillin, every entry in the medical record was a silent demonstration that science and compassion could coexist and surpass any ideological doctrine. The testimonies of the 1990s confirm that the experience was profoundly transformative. One former nurse stated in an interview, "We believed that our medical knowledge was superior, that Germany was the pinnacle of science. But we were forced to admit that we were wrong. That systematic, organized, and ethical care showed us another way of being professional." Another said, "When you see patients on all sides treated equally, you realize that medicine is more powerful than any law or army. Every cure is an argument against hatred." This repetition of consistent humane experiences generated a kind of voluntary, non-coercive conversion. Morality and technique came together in order to alter the deep perception of what it meant to serve medicine. The impact of this experience was not only personal, but collective. Upon returning to Germany, these women took with them not only improved medical skills, but a transformed ethical code. Healthcare institutions, nursing schools, and hospitals, rebuilt from 1945 onward, incorporated these practices, prioritizing patient advocacy and clinical ethics over hierarchy or political loyalty. Every act of care learned in the US has become a pedagogical tool. The phrase "medicine without hatred is stronger than any regime" came to synthesize not only individual experience, but the philosophy that would guide the reconstruction of an entire generation of health professionals. A striking statistic reinforces the reach of this legacy. Between 1946 and 1960, more than 15,000 nurses trained or trained by former American prisoners implemented protocols learned in the camps, directly impacting the lives of hundreds of thousands of patients. Each reorganized hospital represented a microcosm of what had been witnessed: controlled abundance, ethical practice, rigorous scientific application. It wasn't just technology or supply. It was an operational philosophy. Treat everyone with dignity, save lives, and at the same time teach by example. And although half a century has passed, the accounts remain consistent. Former nurses remember that the conversion process was not immediate but cumulative. The initial shock at American abundance and impartial care evolved into understanding, then acceptance, and finally conviction. The repetition of the medical gesture was transformed into a moral experience. The same hand that administered medicine to an Axis prisoner also saved a wounded American soldier. This daily experience taught a lesson that no manual or court could replicate. Universal care trumps the most rigid ideology, and respect for human life is a more effective tool for change than any decree. But the philosophical synthesis was only completed when these women began to reflect on the past. Letters and diaries show that the realization of his own complicity, even if unconscious, in the practices of the Reich, made the American experience even more impactful. One nurse wrote, "I learned that medicine without hate is possible, and that this is what we must teach those who will come after. War has not killed our humanity. American compassion saved us." Every gesture repeated in the American camps, every dose of penicillin, every clean uniform, every attention to the patient became a moral and pedagogical argument, etching into the consciousness of a generation that had once been trained to obey an ideology of death. As the nurses' collective memory was consolidated, a pattern emerged. Conversion was not forced, but lived. Every daily gesture was a witness and agent of change. Every medical practice of abundance, every ethical procedure, every egalitarian treatment has functioned as a silent demonstration of the power of medicine over hatred. The phrase that echoes in the report sums it up. Medicine without hatred is stronger than any regime. It summarizes the experience, the transformation, and the lesson that would extend to the following decades. Ideology can dominate territories, but compassion and science can dominate consciences. And with that understanding, the narrative prepares for the ultimate conclusion: how all of this experience translated into lasting changes in the post-war German medical system, how American abundance, ethics, and scientific practice shaped a new generation of healthcare professionals and cemented an invisible but powerful legacy. The next and final part will bring together all these lessons and show the ultimate impact of these nurses on the reconstruction of Germany, transforming experiences of captivity into pillars of truly humanitarian medicine. On July 2, 1944, When the German nurses emerged from the cave in Cherbourg, sunlight not only illuminated their exhausted faces, but also the end of an illusion. The Reich, which for years had boasted of its scientific and ideological supremacy, was collapsing. It was not only the tanks, the bombardments, and the military strategy that marked his defeat. It was the realization that American industry, logistics, and medicine functioned with precision and abundance that Germany could never replicate. Every hospital supplied, every plasma transfusion, every dose of penicillin delivered with rigor and humanity dismantled Nazi pride, showing that the true strength of a nation lies in the ability to transform, heal, and organize resources in an intelligent and ethical way. What began as surprise and disbelief became learning, repentance, and for many, quiet conversion. The nurses not only survived captivity, but became agents of reconstruction, bringing to Germany the philosophy of a patient-centered medicine free from the ideology that once reigned. The universal lesson of this historical episode is clear. Logistics and production capacity determine the strategy and effectiveness of any operation, whether on the battlefield or in the reconstruction of a society. Volume, abundance, and operational consistency can trump the most sophisticated tactics, the most entrenched propaganda, or the blindest pride. As one captured German officer summed it up, and reflecting decades later, we were defeated by trucks, syringes, and planning, not by soldiers. This truth closes the historical analysis and, at the same time, invites reflection. If you value research and the search for historical truth, like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment on the most shocking data you discovered, and activate the bell so as not to miss the next devastating historical fact. But the story doesn't end here. The bridge to the future is already forming, as there are thousands of stories yet to be revealed, experiences that have transformed men, women, and nations in unexpected ways. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story and discover how science, compassion, and organizing can redefine not just battles, but history itself. War ends when hatred is healed, not with weapons, but with compassion.